All right, let's get rolling. So first of all, welcome. Happy daylight savings, everybody. We are easing into spring. Welcome Anna from World Central Kitchen. Welcome Ellen from Vivint Health. Greg from same organization. A lot of other folks. Welcome Carmen from WBGO, New York Public Radio. Definitely listened to some of that growing up in New Jersey. A couple other big things. By the way, if you haven't already introduced yourself in the chat, please share something bringing you joy. A couple things that stood out to me. It's Kristen's birthday this weekend in Iowa. So happy birthday, Kristen. Hope you celebrate well. It was Christine's birthday last week. Great to see you. And the Northeast Ohio crew on Friday. So happy birthday to you. Sue has both a new job and freshly back from the Caribbean. So Sue, we are all jealous of you. Julia's heading to Nepal soon. So that's amazing. If you have been to Nepal, please drop some hints in the chat for Julia about what to do. Melissa's getting her garden going in North Carolina. We saw Paul from the Corporate Chaplains in Cincy. Great to see you, Paul. Welcome to the FreeWill family. Kate in Salt Lake City just adopted a litter of puppies. So I'm sure you have your hands full. We wish you very well. Jody in North Carolina is doing her daughter's wedding invitations this weekend, which sounds really fun. So good luck with that. I'm sure that's a lot of work. Lots of other great things. Sounds like a beautiful day in Washington, D.C., where a bunch of folks are coming in from. Hopefully sounds like a beautiful day in Canada, where a lot of folks are joining. A little bit of a northeastern New Hampshire. So hopefully you all are doing okay. A lot of good stuff, some good snow across the upper Midwest as well. So super excited to have you here. I would say two big things that are bringing me joy this week. On the family front, my sister is visiting, actually from Durham, North Carolina. So North Carolina is very top of mind at the moment. She is between jobs, so she's taking a couple of days, and she's got 2 kids and a full family there. So don't get to hang out with her much. So it's really nice to have her here. So that's one big thing. Second big thing, and some of you emailed me to ask about this. FreeWill historically banks with Silicon Valley Bank, and so last week was one of the scariest weeks of my professional life. We have a best-in-class finance and accounting team that worked way faster than most companies. We were very well protected. Everything has turned out 100% fine, but generally terrifying. So that is something that I did not expect to handle last week. And the first major bank run in 15 years happened to be at our bank. So glad to have survived that. If any of you also went through that trauma, let me know. We can commiserate at some point. But things worked out. And so very grateful to a wonderful team here that made that all possible. So it's great to be much more relaxed than I might have been on a normal Tuesday. So thank you all for the well wishes. Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Courtney. All right, let's dive in. So we are going to talk about fundraising from the Gen X generation today. Working title, Effective Fundraising Strategies for a Forgotten Generation. We talk about this because people want to talk about millennials all the time. Baby boomers, largest population, largest generation in the history of America, obviously gets a lot of good attention, and people tend to forget about Gen X. I believe that a lot of you all are in this generation category. Feel free to shout out if you are. Also, feel free to not tell us your age if you don't want to. But it's a really big part of fundraising. Quick note before we get started, event is 1.0 CFRE credits. So thank you for the folks on the FreeWill that made that possible. And at the end of the session, we will drop in a survey and just make sure to note that you were here. So do that, very simple. Some quick intros. We'll sort of dive into Gen X as a population. We'll talk about how they give. We'll talk about what to do about it, right? So that's the broad outline of today. Big note is that we will send the recording and the slides later. So if you want to take notes, feel free. And if not, no problem. We'll send them to you later. You can also share them with your colleagues. A lot of times people find this very helpful to share with their teams. All right, a lot of Gen X on the cusp. People call the Oregon Trail, older generation of millennials. So have some in common with you, but not quite Gen X. All right, so my name is Patrick. As I mentioned, I'm an older millennial alongside my wonderful co-founder, Jenny, who's sort of a middle millennial. And we get to work alongside a wonderful and diverse team of 200 folks $7.5 billion raised to date. We now work with 1,150 nonprofit partners, which is super exciting. And we've got this great team that is increasingly age diverse. So a lot of Gen Zers, a lot of millennials, a lot of Gen Xers, some baby boomers. I don't think anyone from the silent generation, but that tends to be a more retired group. All right. And then before we get started, last thing, we're just so grateful to have you here. We're so excited you're spending an hour with us. So we are going to send one of my favorite books called The Power of Less, which is just about how you build focus and calm and clarity in work, in life, and other things, by Leo Babauta. I never said that name out loud. I hope I pronounced it right. And we'll send this to 20 folks. At the end of the session, we'll drop a survey in it, same place where you get CRE credits. Make a note there, and we will send it to you. So please make a note in the survey at the end. All right. So we asked you how you're feeling this week, and generally pretty even from 2 weeks ago, which is good to see. Same thing on how you're feeling about hitting your goals this year. So we have some big ups and some big downs, pretty even across the board from 2 weeks ago. So good to see that leveling out a little bit. And hopefully we'll be able to increase that a little bit by the end of the session. All right, so let's talk about Gen X. So many of you are Gen X, and we're going to talk about you for a moment. When we ask you all how you think about Gen X, here's the big things that show up: independent, busy, savvy, engaged, ignored, also loyal, driven, involved, young, it's all relative, right? Cautious, impact, generous, growing, a lot of stuff here, right? So it's like most generations, it holds a lot of contradictions, but it tends to be a really busy one, busy and independent, very different. So let's dive into sort of understanding this group of people, many of whom we know and love, and then we'll talk more about giving. So who are these people? First of all, they were born from 1965 to 1980, which makes them about 43 to 58 in 2023. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about Gen X. They will always be born in these years. They will get older year over year. But some people call it middle-aged, probably young middle-aged. There are 65 million of them. Now, this is one of the really important things about understanding Gen X. There are fewer of them than millennials, and there are fewer of them than boomers. So they are inherently a smaller generation. We'll talk about why in a second. By 2028, they will outnumber boomers, though. Why is that? Boomers are older. They are about 59 to late 70s in 2023. And so some of them will be passing away. That's how life works. By 2028, there'll be about 64 million of them. Obviously, it means 1 million Gen X will pass away by that time, and 63 million boomers in that period. So why is this generation a bit smaller? Well, it's two things happening at the same time. First is you go look at the 1970s into 80s birth rate, right? So people at that time were having fewer children per woman, which is how demographers calculate birth rates in a given country. Now that's part of the story, but the other part of the story happens way earlier in the 30s and 40s, right? So the folks who were not born in 1940 were not having children in the 70s. And so their parents' generation, for the most part, right? So some of them are born to older boomers. Some of them are born to what we call the silent generation, AKA the demography baby bust that happens before the baby boom, right? So fewer, we'll show this in a second. Let's dive in here. This silent generation is tiny, right? 47 million people in that age bracket compared to 76 million boomers. It is therefore no surprise that that population had fewer children because there were fewer parents to have fewer kids in that sort of 25-year, 30-year later period, right? So just to stare at all of this, it's not intuitive to many people that there might be more 60-year-olds in America right now than 48-year-olds, right? You wouldn't actually think that, and yet that is true. Right now, there are more people who are 60 than who are 48. And so we've got to understand that this sort of smallness relatively, right? 55 million people is still a lot of people, but compared to millennials, compared to baby boomers, a little bit smaller, and therefore a different breed. So what defines this generation? Well, first of all, they were born when fertility rates began to decrease and more women enter the workforce. Also one of the first generations whose parents had lots of access to modern birth control. They were raised in the 70s and 80s. 70s was called the cult of the adult versus the 1950s cult of the child that the baby boomers were born into. Anyone know where this image comes from, by the way? You can write that in the chat while we do this. Often called the latchkey generation. Why is that? First generation where it was very common for two parents to be working full-time. All right, Alex, the Gen Xers are coming in strong with high fidelity, right? So that's where this image comes from. It's a young John Cusack if you're paying attention. And so the more educated their parents, the more likely there would be latchkey, right? So you sort of had all these folks entering the workforce. Things got a little more expensive, many more dual income households. A lot of kids sort of raised themselves, hence the term latchkey. Increase in higher education, again, contributing to this, right? So nearly 30% of Gen X has a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to twice as many as their parents, 25% of boomers, and then millennials are more educated than Gen X on average, right? So you see this real shift. I'll be curious to see what the Gen Z numbers are. It might be half of folks get a bachelor's degree in that cohort. Some economists will call this the last generation where higher ed was broadly financially rewarding, which is depressing. But you look at how much higher ed costs for this population versus millennials, it's radically different, right? So it's not that they made more than millennials, it's that higher ed cost a lot less when they went. Also, the first generation where more women than men had bachelor's degrees and postgraduate degrees. So that was a big shift from boomers. Other things we'll see. All right, other things to note. They are part of a general trend of declining marriage and parenthood rates. So 66% of Gen X have married, same as boomers. More have never married. That should say are married, by the way. More have never married than boomers, compared to 10%. And 62% of Gen X women have given birth, less than boomers as well. These numbers go, pretty precipitously down for millennials. The other thing we're going to look at is they're very entrepreneurial, way more entrepreneurial than other generations, which is really interesting to see. So people often think of startups and tech as millennials, but it's much more commonly Gen Z. Gen Z drove the dot-com boom at the 2000s when most millennials were still in high school or middle school. They own most of the small businesses in the United States compared to any other generation. So 46% of all, that's a plurality. 55% of startup founders are Gen X. This is something that people do not realize for the most part. They mostly think they're young college kids. I believe the sort of most successful age of being a startup founder is about 42. And so many of those folks would fall in this category or, started a few years ago. Elon Musk, Jack Dorsey, Larry Page, and Sergey from Google, these are all Gen X founders. And so that's a big component of this cohort. Now, why are they more entrepreneurial and how do they sort of get this way? Well, unlike a lot of other generations that tend to be more liberal and shaped by the Kennedy years, the Obama years, the Clinton years, these folks were shaped by the Reagan years. So they grew up in the 80s, in the recession, federal debt tripled, increased focus on defense programs, cut to domestic aid, the crack and AIDS epidemic during many of their formative years. They saw an increase in crime, anti-drug laws, and prison population. They tend to be more skeptical when you do this sort of polling and research of government involvement compared to millennials. They are more conservative than boomers on economic issues. So this is a really important point. I want us to hold this in our brain because we're going to come back to it in, 15 slides when we talk about giving. So more skeptical of government involvement, more economically conservative than boomers, right? More socially liberal than boomers, more economically conservative. So let's map out let's sort of everyone, some of you who in Gen X can sort of just relive this. For the rest of us, we're gonna step into your shoes for a moment and really sort of try to understand the changes that happened in your life that now shape your behavior as a donor and as a human. So you're born in 1973, amongst fertility rates dropping, we're at the peak of the oil crisis and economic recession. At age 2, so you're 2 when the Vietnam War ends, you're age 8, 1981, when Ronald Reagan assumes office. Age 9, unemployment hits 11% in the early 80s. It's only about 3% right now. So give you a sense of how different that is. In 1984, you're 11 years old, right? So you're a kid in middle school, and the modern at-home computer comes out, So you can imagine how formative that is. Also, at 11, Run DMC becomes the first platinum selling hip hop group. And Gen X is really the generation that invented hip hop. Age 16, the Berlin Wall falls and marks the unofficial end of the Cold War. So that's a really big shift. You think about that 16, that's sort of what 9/11 is for millennials. Age 18, the 42-day Gulf War occurs, what people commonly call the first Gulf War in the United States. 1991, you're also 18, CDs overtake cassettes. So you would have had a big cassette collection and started to move over to compact discs. Some of you might have hung out with that sort of mini disc player for a short time. Age 20, so you're in college or around college age when AOL gains popularity. Everyone in this generation knows exactly that sort of dial-up tone from AOL. The internet starts to go mainstream. I know some folks in this generation that actually are married, and they met in one of the first chat rooms on AOL, just to give you a sense of the experience there. Age 21, Saturn News, Nirvana lead singer Kurt Cobain dies of suicide. And as many of you would have known, early 90s, starting in Seattle, huge grunge scene really influenced music from this generation. Age 27, the dot-com bubble burst. So, it was really beginning into your peak early professional years, dot-com bubble bursts. Age 28, 9/11 happens. Cell phones are becoming ubiquitous. It's the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, the second major wars of your lifetime. Or third, I guess, with Vietnam at age 2. You're 34 when the iPhone comes out. Smartphones quickly become ubiquitous. Also, the beginning of the housing crisis and the start of the Great Recession. Age 35, the first Black president is elected in your lifetime. So again, sort of solidly middle of your professional years. Blockbuster goes bankrupt, right? This thing that was an enormous part of your entire life, say until 2007, starts to disappear. And you've watched the end of cassettes. You're now seeing the end of CDs with that iPhone. You're seeing the end of VHS. So technology changing as part of your existence. 42, gay marriage becomes legal nationwide. Age 47, 2020, pandemic creates historic societal shifts. Also, the first female vice president or president is elected. So that was a big shift in your life. And that's what it looks like. A couple of people are commenting on RIP Blockbuster. We didn't really mention the BlackBerry, MTV, great, very clear omission, bunch of other things, right? So if you're in Gen X, feel free to jump in some of the other big things. The Challenger explosion, that's a really important one. What year was the Challenger explosion? Someone can name it. I think I was too young for that to be a big. 1986, 86. Okay, yeah. So I would have been 2. Not that useful. Thanks. All right, so that's what it looks like. That's your life. Obviously a lot of other things are happening, but that's what it looks like. So if you're not a Gen Xer, just imagine all those changes happening. Imagine being 11 and you probably don't have your first Apple, but maybe your friend has it. You go over and you just sort of stare at the screen for hours and hours. All right, so that's Gen X. Welcome to we're now fully immersed in Gen X for the rest of the time here. What percentage of the donor base, and we asked you 40 to 60, which is a little bit more expansive than Gen X, but we wanted to make it really easy for you to give your best guess. And so what we see here is, man, almost 12% of you all say this is our core group, 75 to 100%. 45% say more than half and up to 3/4. 30% say 1/4 to a half, and then about 14% say less than 1/4, right? So this is a really meaningful chunk here. Now, again, 40-60 is a little bit more expansive than Gen X, but to make it easy and give you a really good sense here. What percentage of your money comes from 40 to 6-year-olds? I'm just going to go back here for a second. And what you see is that on average, people give a little bit less, right? Your 60-year-olds are giving more. And so you still see slightly smaller percentages at each level, right? So 1/3 of people between 50% and 3/4, 17% above 3/4, 29% say 1/4 to a half, 20% say less than half, right? It's pretty predictable. But so what we're talking about here is Gen X is here, they've arrived, they're a really meaningful chunk of fundraising at most places. So this is super important. All right, so let's talk about trends in Gen X giving. 55% of Gen X in America donates to charity. They are a smaller generation than others. On average, they give about 23% of all charitable dollars, right? So boomers give 41%, millennials give 14%, the rest coming from silent generation, and a little bit Gen Z, although Gen Z is not chipping in that much yet. They're also very charitable with their time. 24% believe that volunteering actually has the greatest impact, and they tend to be very volunteer heavy. How else do they compare? They're now falling behind millennials in terms of annual giving. Annual giving amount decreased a bit while millennials increased, and their volunteering hours also have decreased slightly. This is from about 2016 to 2022, just to give you a sense. And so Gen Z surpassed them in second place, and millennials ranked highest with 36 hours. So they're the third most volunteering after those other two generations. It's not surprisingly younger people tend to volunteer more. Usually not having kids makes it a lot more viable to do so. Remember, they grew up with the internet, right? They are the most entrepreneurial generation. They really use a lot of Google search to find info on charities more than any other generation. 70% give online through a charity's website, right? This is of donors, by the way. So this is why it happens a bit more. 12% give via direct mail. We'll talk more about that later. And a lot are likely to donate via social media appeal. 31% say they connect with charities once a month through e-newsletters, or just a fancy way of saying email. But probably it's the case that more people actually do that than self-report. Other big trends in this group, just to dive in a bit more, giving to faith-based organizations has gone up a ton since 2016, 51%. And health and medical charities also went up by 50% from this group, again, in 2022 from 2016. So that's a really big deal. When we look at the top areas of giving, health is number one. And you can look at this compared to everybody else, right? So health, way higher than it is for other generations. On that far right, by the way, matures here is what many people call the silent generation. So matures or silent generation. Local social service, really big animal group. So highest animals except for Gen Z. A lot of children-related stuff, highest children except for Gen Z and millennials. Emergency relief. Notice that worship is lower on the list here than it is for other generations, including ones coming after it. So millennials, Gen Z, boomers, and matures, you see it as 1 or 2, and then in Gen Z, number 4, all the way down to, I think, number 6 for Gen X, just noting that. Military also on the list. You see that military shows up for Gen Z, not at all for millennials, which is interesting. All right, what else do we know about Gen X, right? So when we talk about people that have capacity to become big donors, there's only a couple different avenues, right? You can earn it through compensation, you can earn it through investments, and you can inherit wealth, right? Those are really the 3 meaningful ways to have any money. You could win the lottery, you could win a lawsuit, but for the most part, this is how people get wealthy enough to make big gifts. And the important thing to understand about Gen X is right now they are in their peak years for all 3 of these paths. And the pandemic actually accelerated them across the board. So we'll talk about this. Gen X has experienced the biggest wealth gains of any generation since the pandemic began. Their aggregate net worth soared by 50%. Their total worth increased by $13 trillion, just above baby boomers. And they now own 29% of all US wealth. Now, this is impressive because, again, they're a small generation. Since 2010, the median net worth of their households has risen by 129%, so way more than doubled. It's, again, pretty exciting for them as donors. Why did this happen? Well, partly they're just generally better off. They have $100,000 more wealth per capita than baby boomers did at exactly the same age. They're in their best earning in their saving years, and they're bouncing back from the Great Recession in 2008, which is now deeply in the rearview mirror. And what we saw here, actually, one more thing before I do that, there's this interesting dynamic, right? So they're commonly seen as the sandwich generation in this 40, 50, 60-year-old level. And what they're doing is, so think about sandwich generation as a micro generation within Gen X. And some of this will be you all as well, right? You have caregiving needs for your parents or your guardians, and you're financially supporting children at the same time, right? Especially those sort of either late teens, early 20s, not yet sort of financially independent level. And so they're a little bit pessimistic about their finances, but they're also most confident in their ability to withstand crises. So they've been through a lot and they've navigated it, but they're also sort of pessimistic about the future because they've been through a lot, but they also have this resilience. So it's this really interesting dichotomy across the board. All right, so that's what we know about Gen X. Let's talk about a little bit of insights and get to know them a little bit more. So one, again, as I mentioned, they're in their peak earning years. They were the hardest hit by the 2008 recession, but have fully recovered. They're now in the later stages of their careers, especially those older Gen Xers. They're in higher earning positions. They make up 25% of the population, 31% of the US income, right? So they are earning a lot of money now. Average households earns this much per year, 113K, more than any other generation, more than boomers, more than millennials. So generally a good sign there. Also, pandemic and low interest rates over many of the last years, with the exception of the last 12 months, saw a huge housing boom that's padding Gen X pockets. More than 2/3 are homeowners. Over the past year, they've seen a 10% increase in their home equity. They now own 29% of household net wealth compared to 17% in 2017. That's a really, really, really big shift, right? Really big shift. Part of this is that even with a little bit of a rough 6 months in the markets, their investments have appreciated very quickly over the last couple of years. The stock market is way above where it was at the beginning of 2020, and 38% of Gen X owns stock. They hold 26% of the total stock market, only second to boomers who own more than half, right? So one sort of recurring theme here is boomers are still super well-to-do, and there's a lot of them. We'll talk more about that later. But you can see Gen X is really stepping to its own on investments. They are set to inherit much of this great wealth transfer. So those of you that have talked to us for a while know that planned giving is about to become wildly important. Why is that? Because $70 trillion plus is going to get passed on as boomers age. Now, the oldest boomers have the youngest Gen X kids, and younger boomers have millennial children. That's why millennials are so big. Most of the kids are millennials, but that first money is going to come to Gen Xers. They're expected to receive about $31 trillion over the next 2 decades. That is a ton of money. They'll inherit more money than any other generation, and they will become the dominant givers here. When we look at some estimates here, and this might be aggressive, but a company called Cerulli Associates looks at the great wealth transfer and said, okay, some of it's going to other boomers, a lot of it's going to Gen X, and a lot of it's going to millennials, right? These years are this graph's a couple years old, which is why that age doesn't quite match up with what we're talking about. But they might not feel particularly wealthy despite that wealth, right? So we talked about the sandwich generation, and what you see here is who are the people who are caring for a parent over 65 and of a child under 18. And it's that 40 to 60-year-old bracket that we talked about that isn't entirely Gen X, but is mostly Gen X. And that's where these folks live. And so there may be some stressors financially as well. So we have this transition, we have this generation in transition. They're getting older, they're paying off debt, they're acquiring wealth. Many historically have only given modestly, or they're new to philanthropy, but it's about time that they're going to start giving quite a bit more, right? Their giving capacity is growing rapidly, and these will soon be many of your most affluent donors. They're also wealthy, but not retired. This is really important. It's very different than how you treat a 68-year-old retiree. A 58-year-old who's equally wealthy is going to need a different strategy. We'll talk about that in a second. But it's important because so often your current strategy is set up around retirees, which is not this group. All right, so Gen X, this is the generation that's going to move from annual to major giving, about to be many of your most important donors. When we look at how they're growing, right? So you can see average donation per year. This is 2010, 2013, 2018. You can see how quickly it's growing. It's up 23%, or up to 23% of all giving. You see boomers on the way down, mature generation on the way down, millennials on the way up, Gen Z just starting to emerge here. So you can see over time, this will be more and more and more. but boomers are still the dominant givers in America, right? But you can see boomers average giving going down, Gen X going up, millennials going up. So this is, we're going to hand the baton at some point over the next 10, 15 years. Now, remember, I told you these folks are more economically conservative. They were raised in the Reagan years. They are more skeptical of government intervention. And what it means in philanthropy is that they care much more about tax-friendly gifts than other generations. In fact, this might be the most important thing to take away from our conversation about Gen X. 42% see a gift's tax deductibility or tax advantages as a big motivator, nearly twice as much as any other generation. Okay, let's stay with this for 1 second because it's the most important takeaway of the whole session. Almost half see tax deductibility as a huge motivator, twice as much as any other generation. So if you said you had a quarter, a third, a half, 2/3 of the donors that in this age group, we need to start talking about tax deductibility because it's a really big motivator for these folks. Now, only 10% of Americans take itemized deductions for their taxes, but if fundraisers, meaning you, can connect Gen X with tax-friendly ways to give, you're going to have much bigger gifts from the same people, right? So this is an incredibly important, this is the core part of the strategy. If we were going to do a 1-minute webinar, it would be this slide. Getting these donors to give stock or crypto or donor advised funds instead of cash will save them capital gains taxes for the most part, and generate a lot bigger gifts from the same folks. Gen X falls closely behind boomers in listing minimizing capital gains taxes as a top reason for setting up donor advised funds in 2022, for instance, right? You see this sort of tax savviness. Remember what's happening? Why is this? Well, they're educated, right? They're financially savvy. Many of you call them savvy. Also, they don't like taxes that much. And so these things combine to people really hunting for these other gifts. The average total DAF dollars received in organizations, for many of you, which is going to be $1 million to $2 million, was $400,000, sorry, $1 million to $10 million. And this is going up year over year. So these gifts are really big. So now is the moment to talk to them about the most impactful ways to give. Obviously, planned giving is pretty useful. Many Gen X folks are never married and without children. Now, one of the things you might not know is that folks who are never married without kids make up about half of all planned giving dollars, despite being a relatively small percentage of the total population. Now, you can sort of understand why, but if you have volunteers of any age or donors of any age that fall into this category, these are your #1 planned giving prospects. They're also starting to make their estate plans now. The average age of someone making a will on FreeWill is about 52. The most common age is 66, though. So you'll see that. All right, let's talk about fundraising strategies for Gen X, right? So first one, remember, high income, not yet retired. What does that mean? It means that for this group is the most important for matching gifts. Why? The gifts are bigger, but they're still working, right? They're bigger than millennial gifts, so matching is going to be more important. They're smaller than boomer gifts, but boomers are retired. So Gen X is hitting their peak earning years. Many of your donors will work for companies that match charitable gifts. If you know your donors' employers, ask them to submit a match. Generally, when you get a gift from someone in Gen X, you should ask about this. And I believe that employers offering matching is listed on Charity Navigator. So you can always do that for free and check that out. That's a big one. Easy way to get a bunch more money. If you don't know their employer, you can still ask about matching gifts. And people forget that non-cash gifts can often be matched as well. So here's some language you can use. Thank you so much for your gift. You may already know this, but many of our supporters don't realize their employers will match charitable contributions. Does your employer do matching gifts? A really good way to double the impact of your gift, right? So just make sure to copy that sentence. Strategy 2 for Gen X, right? Gen X wants tax-savvy ways to give, and they have tons of stock. So these forms of giving will be more helpful to them because they'll avoid capital gains taxes. They'll also be likely to pass on these tax savings to your organization and give more. Be ready for some very large gifts. And research, as you know, shows that organizations who focus on non-cash gifts grow 6 times faster than other organizations. And so Gen X, this is imperative. When we ask you, though, how well do you think your donors understand how to give stock or how to give crypto? Average is about 2.7 on stock. Average is about 2.5 on crypto. And what that means is there's a really big opportunity for education. So we're going to start including information on stock giving in particular, also crypto if possible, in outreach to supporters, especially if you know who does or doesn't own this. But generally, it's safe to assume that if someone's making any sort of meaningful gift, and I mean $100 or more, and they're in this generation, they'll probably hold some stock or mutual funds. And so we want to start making this part of the norm of our conversations. You can always survey donors to find out, but it's pretty safe to just generally include these in your normal fundraising emails. Here's an example from our friends at Amnesty, which obviously do just amazing work. As you sit down to your taxes this year, this is something for April, right? So they'll send this out around tax season, which means in about a month. As you sit down to do your taxes this year, I want to share 2 ways to save on taxes and financially support our critical human rights work at less cost. One, donate stocks, right? Second piece is around qualified charitable distributions, very important for older donors, not important for Gen X, but you can imagine how much this resonates with Gen X. They're thinking about this. Their taxes are front of mind because it's April. They're all doing their taxes because they're all working. And suddenly we're here with valuable information that is a service to the donors in order to get them to give smarter, right? And you can bet Amnesty's starting to get larger gifts from the same people because people are shifting the way they give. And it's better off for everybody. Other things to note here. I mean, this is really remarkable, right? Video killed, in this case, the direct mail star. So you look at Gen X as the generation that stopped responding to direct mail. So you look at, what channel do folks use? 43% of silent generation uses mail, 27% of boomers, really big shift, all the way down to 14% for Gen X, right? And millennials and Gen Z follow that trend. And so you see this entire shift online, not surprising from the people who got, personal computers at age 11, right? That they're used to this avenue of giving. And this, by the way, is increasingly true for the big gifts, not just the small gifts. So you're starting to see this shift happen. All right, tip 3, a third of Gen X is put off by outdated websites. And plus over half are willing to add a couple dollars to cover processing costs for your small dollar gifts, right? So your online donate page, this is really important, is the only way that many people are interacting with your website. If you are sending them fundraising emails and you're sending them to your donate page, it is the only way that many people are interacting. It gets way more traffic than your ways to give page, than your sort of, deep in the abyss, other information pages across the board. And so this is where stock giving, donor advised fund giving, crypto giving, QCDs has to be on your donate page for this generation, right? It has to be there because this is the moment where you capture those bigger gifts. Make sure your websites are mobile friendly as well. As you can imagine, a lot of these people are accessing these gifts on cell phones, and gifts are being left at a higher rate on smartphone and tablets than ever before. Websites, QR codes, social media, all these things are motivating Gen X to give. Online giving has jumped significantly. This group averaged 6.3 gifts online per year, right? So this is your moment to capture these big gifts, as well as capture, who's got a donor advised fund, for instance. Here's some examples. When you're getting these stock gifts, when you're getting these other types of gifts, you want to have language like this, basically to make sure that people are telling you about them. The risk is that stock gifts get lost in the abyss, and that you might get a stock gift, but you have no idea who it's from, and therefore you can't thank them, you can't steward them, they're mad because they haven't heard from you, and they don't get the meaningful tax receipt they need to potentially save thousands of dollars on their taxes. So if you can't tell who's giving you stock, it's a huge problem and you've got to solve this. Here's a good example of what Southern Poverty Law Center does on their donate page. You can see, yes, you can give cash, but also you can give some of these other ways, right? You can give stocks, you can give through PayPal, you can give through QCDs. This is a really good example. The one thing I wish they had up here was giving through DAFs as well, donor advised funds. Pretty good. Pardon me. And one thing we're seeing right now is that a lot of people are looking at, for Gen X and boomers and millennials, the massive rise in donor advised fund giving, pardon me, and they're using new technology to let people give from their donor advised fund directly on their donate page, sort of the way you would give from PayPal or even with your Visa card. And this is going to radically shift fundraising over the next 2 years because it does two things. And one, it gets much bigger gifts from the same folks. And two, it allows you to identify who is a donor advised fund, which we hear is the #1 problem for a lot of donors. On Thursday, so in basically 48 hours from right now, we'll be doing a demo of this and some other smart giving tools. In the survey, we would strongly encourage you to sign up for that. It'll be about 20 minutes probably, but we'd love to walk you through some of that technology and how other people are using it. It's super cool, and it's really going to change giving over the next 18 months or so. All right, back on website stuff. There are some other things to fix. Remember, this group is growing their wealth, but they are not retired. Much of this giving is going to happen on nights and weekends when they sit with their spouse or their friends and figure out where to give. And so when you have something that says, oh, are you interested in giving stocks? Call us, call Samantha at this number, but Samantha's only working 9 to 5, then you actually lose these gifts on these folks, right? And generally this population, much like millennials, doesn't really want to call strangers on the phone. And so you need to make sure you have avenues to give through your website and not just requiring contact at convenient times for them to do so, right? So I sort of cringe when I see, oh, make sure to call us for information, because these people might not be able to call you during the workday and you're not picking up on the weekends or in the evenings. All right, last thing before we get off this topic is that these folks are really starting to think about planned giving, right? They're 45, 50, 60, maybe their parents have passed away. And so these folks actually account for about 42% of all bequest dollars giving to charity. Now, yes, these bequests are going to be large gifts long term, but also we know that people who make planned gifts increase their giving immediately by 75%. So this is a really big shift. You can also know if someone gives you a $500,000 gift in a will, but it's not realized yet, pretty good sign this person really cares about your cause and organization and might be a good real-time donor in the very near term. So that's really exciting. I hate to sort of end on well, let me first say here, provide easy ways for donors to make wills, obviously, the bequest. Tools like FreeWill are awesome, but also you could do a will-making kit. You could have a list of local lawyers to do estate planning. Anything you can do to make this a little bit easier is going to yield incredible returns for you long-term. So this is just really important. But just to put this in perspective, hold on, we'll sort of skip through this quickly because I want to get to some other stuff. To put this in perspective, remember that we really need to bridge the gap. And so remember that Gen X is a fundamentally smaller generation than the baby boomers, and it's never going to make up for all the giving the baby boomers do. You just can't make up for an additional 20 million people. And so as boomers age and pass away, there are not enough Gen Xers to make up the lost giving. It's just not going to happen. And so what you need to do is figure out how to bridge this gap, right? Make sure to be investing now in planned giving for baby boomers. Otherwise, you risk less revenue, less impact, fewer employees, right? Actually having to lay people off because there's not enough Gen X folks to give at the same level of all the boomers, even if they're all giving exactly the same amount. And so what you see the smarter organizations doing right now is having a plan to bridge the gap between the very large boomers and the very large millennials who will also be giving a ton. And so it's largely going to be about planned giving from baby boomers, while real-time giving from Gen X plays a big role there, but not exclusively, before you get back to millennials giving at much greater rates, not because they're fundamentally better people, there's just more of them. And so we really have to understand how birth rates in the 1920s are affecting giving in modern day. And with that, we are going to pause, share a couple of resources, and do a couple minutes on Q&A before we get everyone off to sort of the next best thing they're doing at 1 o'clock Eastern. So first things first, my colleague Phoebe, I think, is going to drop a survey into the chat. And this is where you can do a couple things. One, please fill this out to get CFRE credits. Please fill this out to get this book, The Power of Less. And so I think that survey is being dropped in momentarily. So if you don't mind hopping on that, Phoebe or Amanda, let me make sure they can do so. Yep, great. Thanks so much, Phoebe. So that is in the chat right now. You can take a look for that and just click on it. That's where you can sign up to get this book. We'd love to have you there, or we'd love to give it to you. We've also just released the FreeWill Donor Advised Fund report. And so this is super exciting. This is a really big in-depth look at donor advised fund trends by types of organizations, by size of organizations, what the big challenges are. We're super excited. A lot of you participated in this and made it possible. So I just want to say thank you to you all for doing this. It's really cool. It's pretty groundbreaking. It's the first time we've done this. And there's some really great research there as well. And then the last thing I'll say before we get to questions is on Thursday, and again, in 48 hours at noon Eastern, now 47 hours, we are going to be doing a demonstration of what we call our Smart Giving Suite. And this includes how to do things like have people pay with donor advised funds on your donate page, how to make stock giving seamless and easy, how to make IRA giving super easy for older donors and taking all the mystery out of it for you, how to give crypto without actually having to take crypto, so you can just get US dollars. We're super proud of this. We'd love to see you there. So there's an RSVP in that same survey, and just make a note there. And we'll do a separate session in 2 weeks from that about how to be featured on the FreeWill public site if you're interested. So make a note there. Generally, FreeWill does lots of amazing things. If you want to learn more about it, either for making your plan giving program much more successful, or for generating a lot more real-time gifts, just make a note in the survey and someone can reach out to you and walk you through that. And with that, we're going to dive into Q&A. So let's do that for a few minutes, and we'll go from there. Thanks again, Phoebe, for putting that in. Great questions. So, a lot of good questions. So Elena said, didn't legislation in the past couple of years makes tax deductibility less strong of an incentive for many folks? So Elena, yes and no. So what Elena's alluding to is that as the standard deductions have gone up, fewer people are itemizing deductions. But what we see here is that giving assets, particularly stock, crypto, and then gifts out of donor advised funds. Why is that? Because most of the gifts into donor advised funds are assets, stocks, crypto. Avoiding capital gains creates a really big benefit, whether or not you're itemizing deductions. And so you're actually seeing an even greater shift into these tax advantaged ways, because whether or not you get that deduction, you avoid those capital gains. So that's a big shift that's happening. All right, other questions. For the tax asks, wouldn't it have to be in the year prior? So Melanie says, why are you asking about, tax savings when April is really taxes for last year? Melanie, it's not that you can sort of backdate your gifts. It's more that taxes are really front of mind. And so as people are thinking about that, it's a great way to have that conversation and going forward, make their gifts a lot smarter. Eric says, are you sending out invites for the session on Thursday? Eric, just make a small note in the survey and we'll send you a calendar invite. So thank you for that. Lauren says, won't the projected gap in giving just exacerbate the trend towards smaller numbers or people giving larger gifts? Won't the wealth just be transferred rather than reduced? Lauren, this is a really interesting point. It will depend on how much that wealth feels like it's needed, right? So you would imagine that a family with 3 minor children with the same amount of wealth as a retired couple might be giving a lot less because they're saving for college or something else. And so some of it depends on, not all wealth is created equal. Some of it feels like surplus wealth, or some of it might feel like really needed wealth. And so my sense is that as boomers age and pass money on, that money is not going to be given at the same rate, even though some folks will be wealthier. Really, really good question. Rob says, when you educate Gen X group about giving via stock, are there resources you can share as suggestions? Quarterly webinars? Rob, we find that webinars tend to actually be a really helpful resource for nonprofit professionals and a relatively poor resource for nonprofit donors. Why? Because again, they're busy with their own work during the day. And so it's harder to educate them that way. Things that might work, short videos that you can play on demand, even clear emails about the value of stock giving and how to do so, that tends to go a really long way. Our innovation team internally looked at organizations who talked about stock giving maybe once or twice a year and saw dramatically more giving at the end of year than organizations that didn't. So you really see the educational value in getting out there across the board. Thank you. Other great questions. We find that Gen X are motivated to make plan gifts by the same tax reasons as current giving, or plan gifts motivated by other factors. We find that plan gifts tend to be much less motivated by taxes for sort of obvious reasons than other gifts. Really, really good question. Really good question. All right, let's take one more question. Miriam says, where would stocks and wires fit into giving channels for Gen X? Thinking about the split between online, mail, social media, SMS. Miriam, I would imagine that most of this is pushed by email. And so you really want to have that website access to stock gifts. And people are really either giving themselves or they're telling their financial advisor to initiate a gift. And then that gift is going to come from the financial advisor, but they're going to be going to your website for instructions as well. So it's got to be super clear there so you don't lose momentum. All right. Let's pause there, give everyone a few minutes before their next session. Just wanted to say a huge thank you for all of you. A huge thank you for the Gen X folks in particular at sharing your experience and your wisdom joining today. But generally, we love having you here. And so just wanted to say thank you for pushing yourself to learn, to improve your ability, your career, and the missions that you're working on. And speaking of learning wildly new things, in 2 weeks, we're going to dive in on the future of artificial intelligence and philanthropy. So this is a totally new topic for us. We're super excited to do it. It will be super interesting, a little scary, a lot of unknowns, a little complicated, but I think it should be a lot of fun. So make a note in the survey also if you want an invite there. We'll send out some calendar invites to that as well. That's at the end of March. Should be great. You can shoot me a note, patrick@freewill.com if you need anything. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find, Patrick Schmitt at FreeWill. But just love getting to spend an hour with you. Thank you so much. And would love to see you on Thursday if you're around, and obviously in 2 weeks as well. So thanks so much. Hope to see many of you in 48 hours and have a wonderful rest of your week.